Sarah had always known that marrying Eric meant dealing with his mother, Evelyn. From the moment she entered his life, Evelyn made it clear Sarah was not what she had envisioned for her son. She wasn't the soft-spoken, pliable woman Evelyn had hoped for, the kind who would nod along and let her mother-in-law dictate the terms of family life. Instead, Sarah was independent, sharp-witted, and successful in ways Evelyn found threatening. At first, it was subtle. A casual remark at dinner about how real women took care of their husbands instead of focusing on careers. A thoughtful but ultimately unnecessary gift, a book on homemaking, left on the kitchen counter with a sticky note, "Thought you could use some inspiration, dear." Invitations to family events relayed at the last minute, or sometimes not at all. Sarah wasn't naive, she understood exactly what was happening. But Eric, ever the devoted son, dismissed it all with a wave of his hand. "She doesn't mean anything by it," he would say with an easy smile. "That's just how she is." That was how Evelyn always escaped accountability, by shrouding her hostility in the guise of concern. She never outright insulted Sarah, never gave her anything tangible to confront. Instead, she worked in the shadows, planting seeds of doubt and discontent, nudging Eric just enough so that his faith in Sarah wavered. She had a way of making Sarah feel like an outsider in her own marriage, like a guest in a home she had helped build. The real battle began when Eric and Sarah bought their vacation home. Nestled in a quiet, wooded area by the lake, it was meant to be an escape, a place where they could unwind from the demands of their high-powered careers. Sarah had spent months overseeing renovations, selecting every fixture and piece of furniture with care, crafting the perfect retreat. And yet, despite the fact that her name was on the deed just as much as Eric's, Evelyn treated it as her own. It started with extended visits. A week turned into 2, then 3. Sarah would return from business trips to find evidence of Evelyn's presence everywhere, her perfume lingering in the air, her favorite tea in the cabinets, a throw blanket draped over the couch that Sarah knew she hadn't bought. The lake house was supposed to be theirs, but Evelyn had made herself at home so seamlessly that it became impossible to reclaim the space. One evening, as Sarah walked into the house after a long day at work, she found Evelyn sitting at the dining table, casually sipping wine. The sight of her, so effortlessly comfortable, so at ease in a house that wasn't hers, sent a cold ripple down Sarah's spine. "I was just thinking," Evelyn mused, swirling the wine in her glass, "that this house is far too much for you two. You're both always busy, always traveling. Wouldn't it be better if someone actually lived here instead of letting it go to waste?" Sarah clenched her jaw. "It's not going to waste," she replied evenly. "Eric and I use it when we can." Evelyn tilted her head, as if amused by Sarah's resistance. "Oh, sweetheart, I wasn't asking for permission. I was just letting you know what makes the most sense." Sarah's breath caught. There was something in the way Evelyn said it, so final, so certain, that made her chest tighten with unease. She knew Evelyn was overstepping, but there was something deeper at play, something she couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't until later that evening, when she checked the house's property records out of pure instinct, that the truth hit her like a freight train. The house was no longer in their names. Somehow, without her knowledge, Evelyn had managed to transfer ownership to herself. The legal technicalities were murky, but one thing was clear: Sarah and Eric no longer owned the home they had paid for. And Eric, trusting his mother implicitly, had unknowingly given her the power to do it. Sarah felt her fingers go numb as she stared at the screen, her mind racing through every possible explanation. How? When? Her stomach twisted as the realization settled. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't Evelyn pushing boundaries or being difficult. This was premeditated. This was war. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the cold glow of the laptop screen illuminating the horror unfolding before her eyes. The house was gone. Not physically, not in a way that would make it disappear from the landscape, but in every legal sense it no longer belonged to her and Eric. It was Evelyn's now, transferred through a tangled web of loopholes, forged permissions, and just enough legal gray areas to make it difficult to reverse. The betrayal clawed at her, but even more infuriating was Eric's role in it. He had given his mother access without thinking twice, assuming she would never do anything to hurt them. He had trusted her more than he had trusted Sarah. When Eric walked into their bedroom that night, he found her still sitting at the desk, staring blankly at the screen. She turned slowly, the weight of her disbelief pressing into every inch of her body. "Tell me," she said, voice eerily calm, "why the deed to our house has your mother's name on it." Eric blinked, unprepared for the confrontation. "What?" Sarah didn't repeat herself. She simply turned the screen toward him, watching as the color drained from his face. She was handling some things for us," he stammered. "We talked about this, remember? The paperwork, the tax benefits." "You mean you talked about it?" Sarah interrupted, standing up. "I don't remember agreeing to sign away our property to your mother." Eric scrubbed a hand over his face, his panic quickly turning to defensiveness. "Come on, you're overreacting. It's not like she stole it, she's family. She's just helping us manage it. It's still our house, just under her name on paper." Sarah let out a dry laugh, hollow and humorless. "Do you even hear yourself?" She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her emails, pulling up the official records. "Do you know what happens now that her name is on the deed? She can do whatever she wants with it. She can sell it, Eric. She can legally evict us from a house we paid for." "That's ridiculous," he scoffed, but there was doubt creeping into his tone. "Is it?" Sarah challenged, her heart pounding. "Did she tell you that? Or did she let you assume she was just helping while she quietly took control?" Eric's silence was the only answer she needed. Her hands curled into fists as she stepped away from him, pacing to keep the rage from swallowing her whole. She wanted to scream, to break something, to march straight to Evelyn's house and demand she fix it. But she knew better. Evelyn wouldn't fix it. Evelyn never fixed things. She owned them, controlled them, bent them to her will, and now she had done it to them. Sarah didn't sleep that night. While Eric lay beside her, his breaths deep and steady despite the chaos he had allowed, she was wide awake, her mind constructing every possible scenario. How far would Evelyn go? Would she actually try to force them out? Would she leverage the house against them, holding it over their heads like some twisted prize? By morning, she had her answer. A courier arrived at their door at precisely 8 a.m., handing Sarah an envelope with Evelyn's signature scrawled neatly on the front. Inside was a formal letter, cold, concise, and entirely predictable. "Dear Sarah and Eric, as you know, I have taken the responsibility of managing the lake house to ensure it remains in the best possible hands. Given your busy schedules, I have decided to make some necessary changes that will benefit the property's long-term preservation. I will be transitioning the home into a fully private residence under my care. Effective immediately, your access will be restricted to pre-approved visits. Please contact me in advance if you wish to use the house so that I can coordinate accordingly. Thank you for your understanding. Warmly. Evelyn." Sarah read it twice. Then a third time. By the fourth, her hands were shaking. Eric read over her shoulder, his expression a grotesque blend of guilt and disbelief. She wouldn't actually lock us out." Sarah turned to him, eyes flashing. "She just did." That evening, after hours of legal consultations that left her with more questions than answers, she drove to the lake house alone. Eric had insisted on coming, but she had shut him down immediately. He was the reason this happened, his blind trust, his failure to question his mother's intentions. The driveway lights were already on when she arrived, and through the large front window, she saw Evelyn sitting in her chair, sipping tea as if she hadn't just stolen an entire property out from under them. Sarah forced herself to take a breath before stepping inside. Evelyn looked up at her with the same bemused expression she always wore when she was pretending to be innocent. "Sarah," she greeted smoothly. "I didn't expect you so soon." Sarah tossed the letter onto the coffee table. "You stole our house." Evelyn sighed, setting down her teacup with exaggerated care. "Darling, don't be dramatic. It was never really yours. I simply made sure it was handled properly." Handled, Sarah repeated, voice dangerously low. You mean taken? Evelyn didn't flinch. You should be thanking me. You and Eric are too busy to maintain this place properly. And given your track record of impulsive decisions, it's best that someone responsible keeps things in order. Sarah's vision went red. You're unbelievable. No, dear, Evelyn corrected, a small smile curving her lips. I'm untouchable. For the first time in Sarah's life, she understood the depths of what she was dealing with. Evelyn wasn't just controlling, she was calculated, ruthless in a way Sarah had underestimated. She didn't ask for power, she took it. But she had made one crucial mistake. She thought Sarah was someone who could be pushed aside. Sarah straightened, smoothing the tension from her shoulders, forcing her heartbeat to steady. You're right about one thing, she said, her tone eerily composed. You are untouchable. You've manipulated the system so perfectly that there's almost nothing I can do. Evelyn's smile widened, as if she had already won. But you should know something, Sarah continued. I don't fight fair. And I don't lose. She turned and walked out without another word, leaving Evelyn to bask in her victory, for now. Sarah spent the next 72 hours in complete isolation, locked in her home office with every legal document related to the lake house spread across her desk. She barely ate, barely slept, running through every possible angle, every technicality, every path she could take to dismantle what Evelyn had done. Every phone call with lawyers ended in frustration. What Evelyn had pulled off was dirty, unethical, manipulative, but not outright illegal. The transfer had been completed using an old power of attorney Eric had granted her years ago when handling some minor family business. Evelyn had weaponized her son's blind trust, signing over the property to herself under the pretense of estate planning and tax benefits. Reversing it would take months, maybe years, and that was assuming Evelyn didn't fight it every step of the way. Eric, now fully aware of the damage his complacency had caused, tried repeatedly to talk to Sarah, but she had no patience for his guilt. Every time he opened his mouth to say I didn't know or I thought she was helping, she cut him off with a look that made him shrink back. She wasn't interested in apologies. She was interested in war. But she needed leverage. Evelyn had stolen their home, and now she was holding it hostage, dictating the terms of when and how they could step foot inside. There had to be something Evelyn had overlooked, some thread Sarah could pull to unravel her mother-in-law's carefully crafted power play. And then, at 4 a.m, as she sat hunched over a stack of property records, she found it. The lake house wasn't just a home, it was part of a historical preservation program Sarah had enrolled it in years ago to reduce property taxes and secure government funding for renovations. It was a long, tedious process, but in the end, it had allowed them to receive grants for structural restorations, and in exchange, they had agreed to keep the house in its original architectural state and open it to periodic inspections. It wasn't something they had ever paid much attention to. The terms were easy enough to follow, and the benefits had been substantial. But now, with Evelyn as the official owner, she was bound by the same agreement. And Sarah knew, without a doubt, that Evelyn had no idea. By the time the sun rose, Sarah had a plan. She waited 2 more days before making her next move. She wanted Evelyn to feel secure, to believe that Sarah had finally accepted defeat. Then, on a quiet Wednesday morning, Sarah made a phone call to the local historical board, casually mentioning that the new owner of the lake house had expressed interest in making some modifications to the structure. Within an hour, she had scheduled an official review with the city's preservation committee to assess compliance with the agreement. Then she sat back and waited for the storm to hit. It took exactly 3 days. Sarah was in the middle of a consultation with a client when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw Eric's name flashing, followed by 3 missed calls from Evelyn. Smirking, she ignored them. 5 minutes later, a text arrived. Eric, what the hell did you do? That was her cue. She wrapped up her meeting, took her time driving home, and when she finally returned the call, she made sure to sound perfectly calm, as if she had no idea what he was talking about. What's the emergency? She asked sweetly. Eric was breathless. as if he had just finished arguing. Mom just called me screaming. The city sent a team to the house today, historical inspectors, some kind of compliance board. They're saying she has to get approval for any renovations, that there are restrictions on what she can do. She says you set this up. Sarah leaned back in her chair, savoring the moment. That's interesting. I didn't set anything up. The house has always been in the historical registry. You remember, don't you? The grant money? The tax benefits. Eric went silent. He remembered. He just hadn't thought about it in years. She's saying they won't let her remodel, he finally said, as if it were the greatest injustice imaginable. That's correct, Sarah said smoothly. Because she agreed to abide by those terms when she took ownership. She can't change the exterior. She can't tear down walls or replace historical fixtures. She certainly can't sell it without approval. In fact, she's legally required to allow preservation officials access to the property for inspections at any time. Eric cursed under his breath. You knew this would happen, Sarah smiled. Of course I did. That evening, as expected, Evelyn showed up at their front door. Not calling first, not waiting to be invited. She simply arrived, letting herself in as if she still owned the place. Sarah was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, waiting for her. You conniving little, Evelyn began. But Sarah held up a hand. Careful, she warned, her voice silk and steel. I wouldn't want you to say something you'll regret. Evelyn's face was flushed with fury. You think you're clever? You think this is a game? Sarah tilted her head. Isn't it? You tricked me, Evelyn seethed. You knew I wouldn't be able to do what I wanted with that house. Sarah shrugged. That sounds like a failure on your part. If you're going to steal something, you should at least do your homework first. Evelyn's hands trembled as she pointed a manicured finger at her. Fix this. Sarah took a slow sip of wine. No, you don't get to say no to me. Oh, but I do. Sarah set down her glass and met Evelyn's gaze with a cool, unwavering stare. You see, that house was mine first. I know every rule, every contract, every clause, and I know that if you don't meet the requirements, the state can repossess it. You wouldn't just lose the house, Evelyn. You'd lose everything you put into it. And from what I hear, you've already started spending money on renovations that aren't legal. For the first time, Evelyn hesitated. Sarah leaned forward, voice low and certain. You wanted control, Evelyn. Well, now you have it. And you're about to learn exactly how little that means when you're trapped in a house you can't change, can't sell, and can't even escape without massive financial loss. Evelyn's breath came fast and shallow, her carefully constructed world fracturing at the edges. You think you've won, she hissed. Sarah smiled, slow and satisfied. Oh, I know I have. Evelyn stared at her, then turned sharply on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Sarah exhaled, letting the moment settle, allowing the victory to sink in. This was only the beginning. Evelyn had made her move. Now, it was Sarah's turn to end the game. Evelyn had gone quiet. That alone told Sarah she was up to something. The woman never admitted defeat, never backed down. If she had stormed out of Sarah's house without another smug remark, it wasn't because she had accepted the loss, it was because she was recalculating. For the next few weeks, Sarah watched and waited. She knew Evelyn wouldn't let things rest. The historical preservation restrictions had thrown a wrench into her plans, but she still legally owned the house. That meant she would find another way to assert her dominance. And soon enough, she did. Sarah came home one evening to find Eric standing in the living room, a grim expression on his face, a thick envelope in his hands. You're not going to like this, he muttered, handing it to her. Sarah took the papers and scanned the first page. Then the second. By the third, her vision went sharp with focus. Evelyn had done exactly what Sarah had expected. She had filed a formal eviction notice, not just against Sarah but against Eric, her own son. Sarah let out a slow breath. She's kicking us out. Eric ran a hand through his hair. She's saying that since she legally owns the house, we're unauthorized occupants. Sarah almost laughed. It was such a predictable Evelyn move, twisting legal loopholes to force control. She can't be serious, Eric continued, pacing. She knows I gave her permission to transfer the deed under false pretenses. She knows I would fight this. She also knows you won't, Sarah said, folding the papers. Because she's banking on the fact that you're still her obedient little boy. Eric's mouth opened, then shut. Sarah stared at him. Tell me, Eric, do you even realize what this means? Your mother is legally forcing us out of a house we bought, and instead of fighting her, you're standing here shocked that she would do this. How much more do you need? How much more proof that she does not care about you? About us, only about winning. Eric sat down heavily on the couch. I don't know how to fix this. Sarah rolled her shoulders, her rage simmering into something cold and purposeful. You don't, she said. I do. The next morning she called Evelyn. To her credit, Evelyn answered immediately, voice smooth and self-satisfied. Sarah, dear. I assume you received my letter. I did, Sarah said. Very bold of you. But you made a mistake. Evelyn chuckled. Oh? And what would that be? You assume I care about staying in that house, Sarah said. But I don't. Silence. Then a measured, go on. Sarah leaned back in her chair. You want me to panic. You want me to scramble and beg. But I already have a place to live. What you don't have is a way out of the mess you made. I don't know what you're talking about, Evelyn said. But there was a sliver of hesitation now. Sarah smiled. I spoke with the Preservation Committee this morning. You've already violated 3 of their regulations just by trying to change the occupancy status of the house. That's grounds for an immediate compliance review. They'll be sending inspectors next week. If they find anything that doesn't meet their conditions, they have the right to seize the house. And do you know what happens if they do? Evelyn didn't answer. It gets turned into a publicly managed historical site, Sarah said. Which means you won't be able to sell it. You won't be able to renovate it. You won't even be able to live in it. It'll become government property, open to the public. Imagine it, Evelyn, strangers walking through your precious home, treating it like a museum. Evelyn exhaled sharply. You're bluffing, am I? Sarah said. Go ahead. Call them. See for yourself. Evelyn's silence stretched. Then, finally, she laughed. It was soft, disbelieving. You think you're clever, don't you? No, Sarah said. I know I am. A long pause. Then Evelyn's voice turned saccharine. What do you want? Sarah leaned forward. You're going to sign the house back over to us. Quietly, no fight, no legal games. In exchange, I'll retract the compliance request before the review happens. Evelyn scoffed. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, Sarah said pleasantly, I'll let the state take it. And then neither of us will have it. Another pause. A sharp inhale. And then, for the first time, Evelyn sounded unsure. You wouldn't. Try me, Sarah said. There was a long, long silence. Then Evelyn sighed. It was a bitter, exhausted sound. You're a real piece of work, Sarah. Sarah smirked. I learned from the best. The next morning, an envelope arrived at their doorstep. Inside was a quitclaim deed, a legal document transferring the house back to Sarah and Eric. No conditions. No tricks. Eric read through it twice, as if he couldn't believe it was real. She actually did it. Sarah took the papers and signed them. Of course she did. Eric turned to her. Expression unreadable. What now? Sarah set the documents aside and picked up her coffee. Now, she said, we celebrate. But she knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. Evelyn had lost. And people like her never forgot. For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe it was over. The house was legally theirs again, the documents signed and filed. Evelyn had lost, and in a rare show of restraint, she hadn't immediately tried to claw back control. But Sarah knew better. Evelyn wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. She was the kind of person who waited. who smiled and played gracious loser, only to strike when her opponent's guard was down. And sure enough, 2 weeks later she did exactly that. It started subtly anonymous complaints to the city about the house's unsafe conditions, then came the property tax reassessment, conveniently triggered by an unknown third party questioning their eligibility for historical status benefits. The final blow came when Sarah received a letter from a lawyer Evelyn was suing them for fraud. Sarah read the document twice, then a third time, making sure she wasn't hallucinating. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, rubbing her temples. Eric, standing behind her, took the papers and skimmed them. "She's claiming you coerced her into signing over the house under duress." He let out a strained laugh. "She says you blackmailed her." Sarah sighed, already calculating her next move. "She's not trying to win. She's trying to exhaust us. She knows she can't take the house back, so she's trying to drown us in legal fees and make us wish we'd never fought her in the first place." Eric looked miserable. "She's never going to stop, is she?" "No," Sarah said, her voice steady. "She's not." But what Evelyn hadn't accounted for, what she never accounted for, was that Sarah didn't break easily. She met with her lawyer the next day, reviewing every accusation Evelyn had made. The case was flimsy, built on insinuations rather than actual evidence. It was designed not to succeed but to stall them, to force them into months of back-and-forth court battles, draining their energy and finances. But Sarah wasn't just fighting to keep a house. She was fighting to end this war once and for all. That night, she made a decision. She wasn't going to play defense anymore. Evelyn wanted a fight? Fine, Sarah would give her one. The next morning, she met with her lawyer again, this time, not just to defend herself but to counterattack. If Evelyn wanted to drag this into court, then Sarah would make sure she walked out of it with nothing left to fight for. She filed a countersuit not just for harassment but for damages. She submitted evidence every underhanded move Evelyn had made, from the fake complaints to the fraudulent tax reassessment attempts. She even reached out to Evelyn's former business partners, who had once whispered about her questionable ethics but had never taken action. Sarah convinced them to finally speak up, building a case that painted Evelyn not just as a manipulative mother-in-law, but as a chronic schemer with a history of exploiting loopholes for personal gain. And then she sat back and waited for Evelyn to realize she had lost control of the narrative. It didn't take long. One evening, as she and Eric sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their lake, Sarah's phone rang. She didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. She let it ring twice before answering. "Hello, Evelyn." There was a long pause. Then Evelyn, voice quieter than Sarah had ever heard it, said, "What do you want?" Sarah took a slow sip of her wine before replying. "I want you to stop. Drop the lawsuit, withdraw your complaints, and never interfere in our lives again." Evelyn exhaled sharply. "And if I don't?" Sarah smiled. "Then we go to court. And when we do, I won't just defend myself, I'll expose everything." Silence. Then Evelyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only something brittle, something tired. "You really don't back down, do you?" "No," Sarah said simply. "I don't." Another pause. Then Evelyn's voice turned cold. "Fine. Consider it over." Sarah didn't thank her. She just ended the call. Because it wasn't Evelyn's choice to end this. Sarah had already won. Sarah didn't believe it was over, not truly, until she saw the official paperwork. A week after Evelyn's call, her lawyer sent her the confirmation the lawsuit had been dropped. The complaints to the city were rescinded. The property tax reassessment request had mysteriously vanished, and Evelyn had gone completely silent. No calls. No emails. No underhanded attacks from the shadows, just nothing. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers in her hands, waiting for the usual rush of adrenaline that came with winning a battle against Evelyn. But instead, all she felt was an odd sort of finality, as if, for the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the next move in a never-ending game. Eric sat across from her, rubbing his face. "She really gave up," he murmured, almost as if he didn't believe it himself. Sarah placed the papers down, exhaling. No, she corrected. She lost. The realization hit Eric in waves. His whole life, his mother had been a force, someone who bent reality to fit her desires, someone who never had to face consequences because she always found a way to shift the blame, twist the rules, manipulate the people around her, but not this time. This time she had backed herself into a corner, and Sarah had made sure there was no way out. Days passed. Then weeks. Evelyn remained in the background, licking her wounds, too proud to admit she had been defeated but too smart to retaliate when she knew Sarah had the legal ammunition to destroy her. For the first time in their marriage, Sarah and Eric were free, and yet, one final moment still remained. One evening, as Sarah was returning home, she spotted a familiar figure standing at the end of their driveway. Evelyn. She wasn't dressed in her usual impeccable outfits, no pearls, no tailored blazers. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of everything she had built for herself was finally pressing down on her. Sarah didn't stop walking. She didn't acknowledge her. She simply strode past, toward her house, toward her life, toward the future that Evelyn no longer controlled. But as she reached the door, Evelyn spoke. "You changed him," she said, her voice devoid of its usual superiority. Sarah turned her head slightly. "No," she replied. "You did." Then she stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. And just like that, Evelyn was gone. Months passed, and Evelyn became nothing more than a name spoken in passing. A ghost of a battle Sarah had long since won. There were no more lawsuits, no more underhanded schemes, no more power struggles disguised as family obligations. She had expected Evelyn to reappear in some way, to send an accusatory letter, to spread rumors, to try and claw her way back into control. But she didn't. The silence remained. And that was how Sarah knew Evelyn had truly lost. Life moved forward. The lake house was theirs, untouched by Evelyn's interference. The city inspections had gone smoothly, and the property remained exactly as Sarah had intended it to be, a place of peace, not a battlefield. The sense of ownership felt different now, heavier, not just because of the legal fight but because of what it symbolized. It was more than a house. It was proof that Sarah had stood her ground and refused to be pushed aside. Eric had changed too. He no longer flinched at the mention of his mother's name, no longer defended her actions with weak explanations about how she meant well. He had finally seen Evelyn for who she truly was. It hadn't been easy. There were nights when he sat in silence, wrestling with the reality that the woman who had raised him had also manipulated him for years. But in the end, he chose Sarah. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, Eric finally spoke the words she hadn't realized she needed to hear. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said, staring at the glass in his hands. "To see her for what she is. To stand up to her." Sarah studied him, seeing not just regret but resolve. He wasn't the same man who had once hesitated between his wife and his mother. "You got there in the end," she said simply. Eric exhaled, nodding. Then, after a pause, he asked, "Do you think she'll ever try again?" Sarah thought about it, about the way Evelyn had looked at her that final night, the quiet defeat in her posture, the way she hadn't even tried to lash out. No, this time was different. Evelyn wasn't just waiting, she had accepted it. "She won't," Sarah said. "She's done." And with that, Sarah let the last remnants of Evelyn's presence slip away, like a storm that had finally passed. The war was over, and she had won.